Excitement is in the air for the Atlanta Falcons 2024 season.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Just visit FanDuel.com to get started. And if you don't know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. the Jolly Green Giant, a.k.a. Mr. a.k.a. And I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for a very long time, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP, still going strong on this illustrious episode. But I appreciate each and every one of you that goes strong with me each and every day. Those of you that are everydayers of this pod that make it your first listen, your first watch each and every day. And all you have to do to become an everydayer is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today I am joined by Tenitra Batiste of Locked On Sports Atlanta, making her triumphant official debut on the Locked On Falcons podcast. It's been a long time coming. And I figured, this week one matchup between her beloved or maybe sometimes maligned Pittsburgh Steelers and the Atlanta Falcons, the team that she covers on a weekly basis here on Locked On Sports Atlanta. This is the perfect opportunity for Tenitra to come on and talk about this matchup because she has a very unique perspective on this particular matchup. But Tenitra, for me, one of the things that I've been often too focused on is like the matchup, the nitty gritty of like this battle in the trenches and whatnot. And sometimes it's week one of the regular season. And sometimes you just kind of stop and smell the roses and just talk about, hey, another football season is upon us. And so I kind of want to pick your brain, sort of like talking about the Atlanta Falcons, the team that both of us cover. And for me is the much maligned team in my life. But, what is the thing that you're most excited to see about the Falcons this year as the season is about to, kick off?
Yeah, I think you make a great point, Free, because I think just being excited about the Falcons is where we start. We haven't had this conversation in 3 years as far as being like legitimately excited, feeling like this team is balanced on both sides of the ball, feeling like this team actually has a legitimate shot. Now, granted, last year there was hope. The year before there was hope. And the year before that, there was certainly hope. But I think this year is about way more than just kind of hope and pie in the sky dreams. I think there's actually legitimate reasons to be excited about the season. And I'm going to start with the obvious, but I'm going to give you a little backstory on why. So the obvious for me, as far as being excited for the season, is what will Kirko actually do? But when I say that, I want to go back to a conversation I had yesterday, right? So you know how it goes, Free. Anytime anybody figures out what it is that we do for a living, all of a sudden they want to have a debate about the Falcons or whichever team we're covering. So yesterday's debate was about the Falcons, and this particular Falcons fan went down the rabbit hole about Matt Ryan. Oh, Matt Ryan was awful. He cost us the Super Bowl. He was the worst ever. And Free, I am not going to stand for that kind of bashing of two, because I really do feel like, and I gave my whole diatribe that I'm not going to go into today about why 2A was always a player I knew that fans were going to appreciate way after the fact, and B, he's the best Falcon ever. And I'm not going to sit here and argue with you people about that at a later time, because Free and I ain't got no time for that today. But the reason I said that about Matt Ryan as well is because there was so much excitement around the consistency, if nothing else, across the 14 years that he was here. Kirk Cousins brings to me that same excitement about a guy that I believe is going to be just as consistent as long as his body allows. Because think about what he did last season. 216 completions on 311 attempts, 2,300 yards, 18 touchdowns, only 5 picks. And Free, we know that was only 8 games before, of course, he went down with that awful injury. Now he's back. I think he has something to prove. And I'm here for seeing an offense that allows Kirk Cousins to A, be Kirk Cousins, and B, utilize all of those offensive weapons that Terry Fontenot went out to get. early in the draft. The other piece for me is this, and I've got two more. I promise I'll move on, but you can see I'm really excited for Falcons fans because I believe that they deserve to have a team that's put out on the field and being competitive. So my second is Grady Jarrett, because I feel like with the, of course, addition of Matthew Judon and everything else that's around Grady Jarrett this season, I expect Grady Jarrett to come back and shine. So if you kind of know whether it's biblical or whether it's numerology, the number 10 is a number that means completion. And I feel like this season he is going to complete the process of his rehab from his season-ending injury that's going to pay big dividends for the Falcons. And Mama Jarrett says she gave him a word, renaissance. And she said for her, that means we are going to see that renaissance, that resurgence of an even better Grady Jarrett. And that's my third one, Raheem Morris. The renaissance of Raheem Morris as a head coach in this league that was long overdue. I think we're going to see that pay dividends and come to fruition this season. So if you can't get excited about Kirko, if you can't get excited about Grady, if you can't get excited about Ra, I don't know what to tell you, Falcons fans, because I'm excited for you.
Okay. Yeah, I think there's a lot to be excited for. I'll throw a fourth thing into the list. I'm excited to see what Zach Robinson's offense is going to be. We've seen the Falcons, reach some very high highs when they've had a really high level play caller, and Zach Robinson is getting similar sort of hype. And so I just kind of want to see how high this team can kind of climb potentially with him calling plays, if he can live up to the hype in that. And again, that's just me getting too much in the nitty gritty of like the matchups and like, okay, we're going to do this against two high coverages and we're going to do all that sort of stuff. That's just the thing that I nerd out about. But those are lots of things that I think are very exciting to see from this Falcon team this year. And I think I agree wholeheartedly with you that there is legit excitement in the air in Atlanta. There has been buzz the last couple of years, but I think now it's like, okay, this is for real. And we'll see if the team can quite live up to that. But again, getting back to what you know best, Tenitra, is this Pittsburgh Steelers team, as well as the Atlanta Falcons. And as we continue today's Locked On Falcons, I want to talk to you about what is the most interesting thing to you in this week one matchup, when you, from your very unique perspective of rooting for the Steelers, but covering the Falcons. And we'll get into all of that, guys, as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So, guys, let's talk about FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, who are giving you a great offer now through September 22nd. All FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. And with a YouTube TV base plan, you'll be able to watch every regular season Sunday afternoon out-of-market game. All you need is a Google account and a current form of payment, and you can cancel anytime. Just visit FanDuel.com to download America's #1 sportsbook. And while you're there, go check out the line for the upcoming Falcons-Steelers week one matchup, where the Falcons are now favored by 3.5 points. This is why I constantly tell you guys, you got to sign up at FanDuel right now, America's #1 sportsbook, because these lines are constantly moving. FanDuel's moving this and moving that. And if you want to take advantage of it, like if the Falcons win by a field goal, you're going to lose money, right? Because they need to win by 4 more points, right? But if you had bet 3 weeks ago, a field goal win would have won you money. So take advantage of this offer. Take advantage of the free trial with NFL Sunday Ticket by going to FanDuel.com, America's #1 sportsbook. So before we get into the nitty-gritty of this week one matchup between the Falcons and Steelers in week one with Tenitra Batiste of Locked On Sports Atlanta, I want to plug another show on the Locked On Podcast Network. That is the new Locked On NFL show, where you're going to have 2 shows daily with Madman Tyler Rowland, giving you that double shot of NFL espresso first thing in the morning, and then stop by the barbershop with Tony Wiggins for some real NFL talk, hot opinions, detailed breakdowns in under 30 minutes. Check out Tony and Tyler on as your second listen on the Locked On NFL show on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So T, let's talk about this week one game, right? Yeah. And again, I think you bring a unique perspective because you have both, the professionalism of covering the Falcons and the sort of personal stake that you have of being a lifelong Steelers fan. And I guess for your perspective, your very unique perspective, what is the sort of most interesting thing that you find in this specific matchup heading into week one?
Yeah, so like you said, I'll tackle it as a fan first, and that way I can get all my crying and tears out of the way, and then I'll come back to being a reporter where I can be in a happy place at least for a little bit. But real talk. So when I saw this particular game on the schedule, and of course, as we know how things kind of played out, I was like, oh boy, this is going to be a tough one because I know how the Steelers are looking to play and how conservatively they kind of play and kind of not a high scoring team versus what this Falcons offense will be, to your point, potentially under Zach Robinson. And I expect them to be a high scoring team. So I thought, wow, this will be an interesting matchup because as a fan, my first question was, how are the Steelers going to win the battle up front? And particularly, I'm thinking about three things and on offense as well. And the fact that right now they've got Jaylen Warren, they've got Isaac Samalu, they've got Troy Fautanu, who are all questionable. So if they're listed as questionable, what is that offensive front going to look like, that O-line for the Steelers as they're continuing to kind of mesh and also continuing to be prepared for Russell Wilson under center? And I'm not quite sure what that's going to look like or what that's going to feel like week one. So I think for me, that's kind of the interesting thing. We've always been, and I say we as in the Steelers, always been known as a team that is going to, if we're going to do nothing else, we're going to win in the trenches on both sides of the ball. But absolutely, I think this season, and even having a new center in Zach Frazier, I'm not quite sure what we are or who we are up front. And I think when we're Najee Harris and Jaylen Warren, the 1-2 punch, I'm very confident that the Steelers have a run game that can at least, how do I put this nicely, Free, that can give a little coverage, a little hiding space in place, if you will, for a lackluster passing game. But with Jaylen Warren questionable, that really makes me concerned about, wow, where are we going to actually get our offense from? That's very interesting to me. And then from a reporter's perspective, of course, talking Falcons, I think what's interesting for me is how the play will match the resume. And you actually already called it out. There's a lot of hype around this Falcons football team. There has been a lot of hype around this Falcons football team, especially on the offensive side of the ball. Ooh, you have Kirk Cousins, and ooh, he has all of the shiny toys in a Drake London, a Kyle Pitts, or even a Darnell Mooney, and a Bijan Robinson, because we know he's a really, really good pass catcher out of the backfield. But all of that said, how's it actually going to play out when you get on the football field? And that's going to be interesting for me, because I'm thinking to myself, okay, this is a Steelers team that, yeah, you went to the postseason, but you also only netted minus 0.4 yards per play, 26th in the league last season. So how are you going to manufacture the type of offense that's going to counter what the Falcons do? But again, Free, it's all about what they do on paper, because we didn't get, of course, to see a lot of that in the preseason. So I'm interested to see if the play matches the resume for the Falcons.
All good points there. And I think you kind of spoke to it a little bit, but I'm curious to pick your brain a little bit further on this in terms of what is the thing that you think the Steelers do that is the toughest challenge for this Falcons team? Is it basically that sort of defensive front that I think everybody looks at this Pittsburgh Steelers has been a strength of their defense seemingly for 30 years at this point in time, going back to, the Bill Cowher days in the early 90s. I'm dating myself with this stuff, but or is there maybe something that's specific about the Steelers that you're very eager to kind of see the Falcons get tested on? Is it that defensive front, or is it maybe some other aspect of this game that you're looking forward to?
Yeah, I'd have to say the defense as a whole, but yeah, definitely it starts and stops with the defensive front for the Steelers. And I think it'll be interesting to see which team kind of wins the battle, because as much as I just talked about all of these tools and all of these toys that Kirk Cousins has to work with, Bijan Robinson is really, to me, where it can start and stop as well. If the Falcons are able to establish the run game against the Steelers, it is going to be a long day, because the one thing you have, and you've got Cam Hayward, you've got Keanu Benton, and they're absolutely able to stop the run. And I think but I absolutely loved the acquisition, the add-on of Patrick Queen. I think that's going to be great for the Steelers, as well as Elandon Roberts. But it's the fact that they have a secondary, starting with Minkah Fitzpatrick, that absolutely likes to stop the run as well. Like, they consider themselves to be run stuffers. He's a run stuffing safety. So I always think about it from a collective, like, this team prides itself on being able to stop the run. But Bijan Robinson is different. And I feel like we never got to see different last season. I feel like Zach Robinson is going to be eager to put his running back in a position to be able to succeed and what he sets up, I feel like Tyler Algier is going to be able to finish. But I do feel like the most so I think it's a juxtaposition of who kind of wins the battle. Like, do the Steelers have the opportunity to impose their will in the run game and then kind of try to make the Falcons one-dimensional and then maybe take advantage of that with who they have, and not just Minkah Fitzpatrick, but of course also Joey Porter Jr. and Dante Jackson? Or will Zach Robinson and company be able to, will that offensive line for this Falcons team, which is where their bread and butter is in being able to have good run protection, will they be able to establish the run early and that way set Kirk Cousins up for success? I'm very intrigued about what that chess match is going to look like.
Yeah. And so we'll kind of flip the script a little bit, talk a little bit more about, this challenges that the Falcons will bring to the Steelers. Again, with Tenitra Batiste, who outside of maybe Chris Carter of Locked On Steelers is probably the person that knows the Steelers best in terms of at least this week on the Locked On Falcons podcast. So we'll flip the script, talk about what's the Falcons are going to do that's going to be the biggest challenge for that Pittsburgh Steelers team as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. Now, guys, passion, drive, and patience, it is the formula for winning championships, and it's also what's going to keep your ride or die alive. And eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. I myself have spent some money over at eBay Motors. Back in June, I purchased some seatbelt covers to maintain my vehicle. Nothing can level up my vehicle to peak performance because it's an old hoopty of a car. Right? I'm not going to tell you what make and model is because I don't want to get clowned in the comments again, like I did a couple of months ago when I mentioned that on the podcast talking about eBay Motors. But, look, my car is old and busted, but I'm going to do everything I can to maintain that thing until the wheels fall off. That is my number one ride or die. I have been with that car for many decades, longer than I have been covering the Atlanta Falcons. That's how long it has been. And eBay Motors has all the parts I need to maintain that thing. They have all the parts you need, right, to maintain your thing. And you have eBay Guarantee Fit. Your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back, because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. So keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guarantee Fit only available to U.S. customers. So as I mentioned earlier, the Steelers team very well. And, maybe whether it's from the perspective of a Steelers fan that you're very concerned, like, oh, I'm worried about this one thing that the Falcons are going to be able to do that could really exploit the Steelers, or just maybe a question that you just don't know, like potentially the quarterback situation. I don't know how the Steelers are going to handle the challenge of Grady Jarrett and David Onyemata and Matt Judon and all that stuff. So I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I give you the floor to answer the question. What is the thing that the Falcons do that you think is going to be the toughest challenge for the Steelers, or the thing that you're most curious to see the Steelers team get tested by in week one?
Yeah, I want to see if there's any way in holy hell that George Pickens could actually be a guy who gives Russell Wilson a bailout. Right? Because I do George Pickens is just different. And I know there was a lot of immaturity that we've kind of seen in him, but I am hoping that there's a maturation process that helps him to understand, hey, you're not just wide receiver one as far as what you're able to do in the passing game and actually catching the ball, but you're wide receiver one and also setting the stage and kind of stabilizing that entire Steelers offense in that particular area, because honestly, they don't necessarily have the type of weapons, even as we can see on the other side of the ball with the Atlanta Falcons, right? The Steelers, to me, it's just George Pickens, and then it's just like, okay, we've just got wide receivers. That's just what it is. I think our tight end is probably, and maybe it's similar to the Falcons in that you've got Drake London, then you've got Kyle Pitts. To me, it's the same thing. It's George Pickens, and then it's Pat Freiermuth. And I think that's kind of where it kind of starts and stops. So my question is George Pickens good enough to be able to manage through what I feel like has now been a well-rounded out Falcons secondary? Like, can he be the guy that actually makes the Falcons think, hey, we have to be honest, we can't cheat in terms of how we cover George Pickens and therefore how we quote unquote kind of cover the Steelers wide receivers? I'm kind of interested to see if kind of I don't want to say one trick pony, but kind of one horse in the stable is going to be enough for what I do really think. Finally, I don't know for you, Free, but we've been having this conversation for a couple of years as well, where we kind of thought, oh, okay, this is going to be the time, right? AJ Terrell is finally going to have somebody in Casey Hayward, who was going to be kind of that complimentary piece. And it seemed like every time he almost had a complimentary piece, he didn't. I think he finally has a well-rounded out secondary. So I'm very interested to see, as much as we talk about a good defensive front, as much as we talk about what Matthew Judon brings to the table and the fact that he is a legit pass rusher that this franchise hasn't seen in well over a decade, my question becomes, okay, but let's talk about the secondary. Let's talk about whether or not this secondary, with now a Justin Simmons in the mix, is actually rounded out enough to give the Falcons what they need in order to keep this particular Steelers team in check. I think they do, quite honestly, because I just don't think the Steelers have enough guns. But I am intrigued to see if George Pickens can at least give them some fits and maybe keep them honest and maybe keep the Steelers team in the game.
Okay, well, I do want to talk a little bit about Brandon Ayuk with you, just because you experienced that drama personally. But I think your point about the secondary with the Falcons, I think there's still an open question at that other cornerback spot with Mike Hughes. But I think you're right that the Falcons feel like whatever issues that may be there at that other spot, that with D. Alford in the slot, with Justin Simmons at safety now, that they have more than enough strengths at other positions in the secondary to compensate for that issue. And it's like, okay, well, if we only have one hole in the secondary, we can scheme around that. And if you had two holes like you potentially had at the safety position with Richie Grant starting there, that was going to be a little too hard for you to work around. So I am also just as curious as you are to sort of see if the Falcons have the firepower in that secondary to deal with a player like George Pickens, who is just so good when it just like, as you kind of mentioned earlier, it's like Russell Wilson breaks out the pocket, he just heaves up a pass to George Pickens 40 yards down the field. That's the one thing that gives me real fear about the Steelers matchup. It's like if Steelers can get a couple of those plays in this game, that will completely kind of break everything the Falcons do is correct until Russell Wilson does his Russell Wilson magic and George Pickens does his George Pickens magic. But on that note of weapons, I just curious from your perspective as someone who was probably living and dying by the daily non-reports, it seemed like every single day, with, the Brandon Ayuk trade is going to happen and whatnot. I'm just curious sort of how did you handle that whole saga and sort of, was it a major disappointment to sort of see it get resolved the way it did the other day with him getting that big extension from the 49ers?
It wasn't free. So in the beginning, I was all excited. I was like, oh dear God, there's actually somebody else who might be. And at that time, there was still that whole facade of, will it be Russell Wilson or will it be Justin Fields? So at the time I was like, okay, regardless of who is QB1, who's under center as a starter for this team to begin the season, if you get a guy like Brandon Ayuk, he can make all the bad go away. So that means you get two of them. Like George Pickens can make you look like the best QB ever, and Brandon Ayuk can do the same, because I just felt like those guys, like you need the 1-2 punch. I don't think you can really live in a world in this current NFL, especially to your earlier point. If you have a team that brings together like a full cadre of secondary, I don't think you can live with just one good wide receiver. So I was so hopeful that maybe they could get him, because as you and I know, having covered this team for all 3 years of the Arthur Smith regime, at a minimum, he has to have weapons. Even with his conservative play calling, you at least need the weapons to give him a shot, an outside shot, to be able to score. So I was encouraged, and then I was devastated, but then I was encouraged again, because the last day leading up to the San Francisco 49ers confirming that indeed they were retaining Brandon Ayuk, the Cleveland Browns did all kinds of trickery to be able to have some cap space to try to bring him in for Deshaun Watson, or if Deshaun goes down for Jameis Winston. And I was thinking to myself, oh dear God, I was just hopeful that maybe we could end up in third place in the AFC North again. I didn't want to be bottom of the barrel free. Like, that's the worst thing in the world. It's enough to have to try to overrun the Baltimore Ravens or overrun the Cincinnati Bengals now that Joe Burrow's back. But to have to be at the bottom of the barrel, if Ayuk could join that Cleveland Brown squad, would have been devastating. So if he's got to go somewhere, or if he had to be somewhere other than with the Steelers, thank God it wasn't the Browns. Just thank God it wasn't the Browns. That's all I can say.
Okay. The Brown Steelers rivalry is only matched by the Falcons Saints rivalry when it comes to this sport. So I do appreciate you providing some insight into that. And my final question to you, T, the Steelers are always an interesting team, because it's like so many times over the last couple of years, it feels like they're on the ropes. Okay,
Yeah.
this is the end of the Tomlin era,
Right.
and they always manage to claw their way out of it and come back from the brink of the abyss and whatnot.
Yes.
Do you feel like that's just how it's going to be in perpetuity? Do you feel like this season is going to offer something different, whether that's better than that or worse than that? What are your expectations for the Steelers team heading into this season?
Yeah, it's interesting because, of course, we have like a thread with Pittsburgh, my buddies who are Pittsburgh Steelers fans, which most of them are, and we were talking about where we're going to land this season. And I said, the thing that frustrates me the most is this. Falcons fans may be aggravated or may have been disappointed or devastated that, oh my God, it was Drake London. Then it was Bijan Robinson. Then it was Michael Penix Jr. How many times are we going to have a top pick where we go for an offensive player when we need a generational edge rusher, right? Here's the thing though, Free. You got a guy in Bijan Robinson who's a generational talent. I believe Michael Penix Jr. is going to show you that when it's his time to ascend to QB1. And I think Drake London has every opportunity to be quite a standout wide receiver in the league. You may hate being a mediocre team and being in a position where you can draft at 4, 8, and 8, but at the end of the day, you get quality players like that when you're drafting in the top 10 in most instances. And maybe sometimes if you're drafting maybe around 13, when you're what I call middling, every single season you get middling results. So part of the reason that we tend to be 9-8 or 10-7 or back in 8-8 when it was 16 games is, yes, Mike Tomlin drags them across the finish line somehow, some way, no matter what. But the other thing is this: you stay middling because you get middling picks in the first, the second, and the third rounds, which means your team probably is going to stay middling. So we're going to have to make a decision as a franchise at some point. I had hoped that this was going to be the year that we would make that jump. But that said, if we're middling again, the only way we get out of middling next year is they're going to have to make a jump and go get themselves a generational quarterback. I guess that guy who maybe is going to be behind a Carson Beck or a Shadur Sanders to make this not be a middling franchise. Otherwise, Free, you and I are having the same conversation, 4 years from now when it's cycling around back to the Pittsburgh Steelers playing the Atlanta Falcons, whereas we'll be having the conversation about the Steelers being middling. But I believe we would be having a different conversation about the Falcons because they got those 3 picks in a crazy way. They got themselves the right head coach now, and Terry Fontenot has made some really shrewd moves to put this franchise back in a position to be a winning culture. And I think my question becomes, this year for us to get back to winning and really being a contender to even be the AFC North division winner or to get out of the division and move on through the postseason, we're going to have to do something drastic next season to kind of reset ourselves.
Okay. Well, T, I never took you as a tanker, but that's kind of what it sounds like,
But we're going to have to make some serious moves. Like we're going to have to be very aggressive in free agency as well. Then I'm good to go. We wouldn't have to tank per se, or if we're willing to say, hey, you can take all of these draft picks, just give me my guy, kind of like the Rams did where they said, F them draft picks.
Mm-hmm.
That's where I am with the Steelers. F them draft picks. Go give them away. Get us some, some really good players, whether that's moving up in the draft, in the offseason, or both. And then you don't have to have a conversation like you and I are having where it's like, okay, well, the Steelers win if, and the answer to that question today would be the Steelers win if they can find a way to keep a potentially high-powered Falcons offense under 20 points. Because typically, if they're able to keep you to about 16, 17, they got a shot. And of course, we know on the converse side of that, the Atlanta Falcons win. Hell, if they score over 20 points, you and I are having a different conversation. For Atlanta Falcons football party next Monday, there will be 3 people on that show that are going to be happy, and then there's going to be me.
I appreciate you joining me, sharing your insight, and letting the Falcon fans know that even though the Steelers have a very illustrious history as a franchise, they can be equally as frustrating as the Falcons can be from time to time. And Falcon fans, you're not alone, right?
You're not alone.
Every fan thinks about their team. You're not special in the way that you think about the Atlanta Falcons. And so, T, I really appreciate you for shedding that light on today's episode and sharing your insights into this particular matchup. I do look forward to talking with you on Sunday evening or afternoon in that postcast. And then, of course, on the football party, hopefully we'll have things to celebrate. We look forward to that. Of course, you can check those out on Locked On Sports Atlanta, as well as Locked On Falcons. Of course, you can find T's work at Tenitra Batiste on X or Twitter. And so that's going to do it for us here on today's episode. Appreciate you, T. Any last words before we duck out of here?
Yeah, I think it's going to be, like you said, it's going to be fun. I think it's going to be a very good matchup. And I do expect this to be one of those games that is going to be intriguing down to the fourth quarter. I do think this is going to be some interesting football and some good football that's going to be played in the bins this coming Sunday.
So, guys, that's going to do it for us here on today's episode. Appreciate Tenitra Batiste. Don't know what the next episode is going to be. It's either going to be a crossover Thursday, or it's going to be my season preview where I'll go through my predictions for the Falcons record, my Super Bowl picks, who's going to make the playoffs, win-loss records for every team, maybe the top 10 mock draft, and, of course, doing some statistical projections. Do it every year on the pod. So that's either going to be the next episode or the crossover Thursday, and then that's the episode. But we also have Jarvis Davis coming later this week as well. So we got a lot in store for you coming for this week 1 matchup with the Falcons as well as this upcoming season. So keep the excitement alive by continuing to make Locked On Falcons your first listen. All you got to do is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. Check out Locked On NFL, the new look Locked On NFL for this upcoming season. Part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.